So, welcome to our evening. And this evening, we're going to have a look at compassion. I know many people have developed compassion, continue to develop compassion, and it's something that we're very familiar with. And so, this evening is really meant as a support for our development of compassion and also perhaps reflection. And the way that our program works is that we um, present and then we turn off the recording and so that we can have a conversation. For now, what we're going to do is first hear the words for Adzam Pelu Rinpoche, and he spoke quite a bit about compassion. And he offered a method which is very well known, but I like to talk about it in the way that I've worked with it and also the way that it was presented to me. And when we talk about compassion, there's a ground, there's a foundation, and that foundation is called the equalizing of self and other. And really, what that means is that it's, as Azam Pelo Rinpoche says, it's an important part of mind training. And what we're doing is recognizing the sameness of self and other in the desire to be happy. And this is so important because a lot of times when maybe we're having difficulty with somebody or we just have no understanding of how somebody is, can't understand at all, this equalizing of self and other and recognizing that indeed all beings really and truly want to be happy. And as we know from learning the Four Noble Truths, unfortunately, many are looking in a direction that does not cause happiness. So, for our work in terms of the development of compassion, which is a natural aspect of the enlightened mind, we'll look at a few points this evening. So, the first one is the equalizing of self and other. And personally, I find that incredibly stabilizing. That when we think of self and other, first of all, we're thinking of both ourselves and other people. So compassion is not just for someone else, it's also for us because we're equalizing self and other. And it's a cultivation. And as we're doing that, it's also a foundation for generosity and for feeling. And when we increase our feeling and our appreciation of both ourselves and other people, it gives us a firm base for empathy. And empathy is feeling. It's feeling what somebody else may be feeling. It's also experiencing what the needs of both ourselves and others. Again, we include both. So we have an increase, we have the equalizing of self and other, and then we have the feeling of empathy. And we also are looking towards that increase becoming what's called immeasurable. So it might seem like a leap from equalizing self and other to the increase of empathy, which leads to the increase of compassion, that leads to an immeasurable compassion. And all of this begins with relaxation because we know that when we're too tense, we're too tight, we're too tired, we somehow cut ourselves off, and it's very hard to feel, it's very hard to empathize. And when we can have some rest and an inner relaxation, it opens us to feeling to empathizing, and to wanting to increase and benefit others. On the other hand, too, is that sometimes we are overworked, overtired, and at that time it's important to remember the refraining from harm. So sometimes we just can't be compassionate because basically circumstance, stress, and so forth. And at that point, it's a different practice. And it's important to know that because we can't push compassion, we can't push wanting to be loving, but we can refrain from harm and remembering that that is a compassionate activity. So I've thought about times when I've personally been inspired by other people and just very simple acts of other people. And I was remembering a time when I was younger and traveling alone in Taiwan. And I went around the whole circumference of Taiwan. And I went to very remote communities. And I was walking down a road, and an elderly couple motioned that I should come into their house. And the house was very humble. It was an open room with one curtain, and their steps were made of empty glass Coke bottles. They're very, very nice people, and they wanted me to come in. And so I came in, and there was a chair or two for them and one for me. And they went to in back of the curtain, and they came out with a glass of milk. And they really wanted me to have a glass of milk. And I thought, how amazing that here are people who are very humble and live in humble circumstances, but they're seeing someone who's traveling and somebody who's walking, and they feel compelled to do something, and they offered a glass of milk. And I know that when I have these experiences, I'm always touched that a very simple experience can bring and illuminate what is so natural. And what is so natural is our innate compassion. When we give ourselves time to relax, we give ourselves time to feel, and the time to connect. And there was another time that I remembered something very similar. And this was in more recent time when I was on the plateau of Tibet, and I was on a long motorcycle ride. And it was a very rough ride because there's a lot of rocks and so forth. And there were no dwellings. There were yak herders, and there were sporadic yak hair tents. And so the person driving the motorcycle stopped and just went to the little doorway of one of the yak hair tents. And he said something, and the woman came out with a glass of water. And she wanted us on the long ride to have a glass of water. And these moments I've thought about recently, one might say maybe they're not dramatic, but they're so impactful. And I thought about that in terms of our own lives. Sometimes we want to do very large acts, or we hear about somebody doing something spectacular, but it's our day-to-day lives that inspire each other and really allow for communities to come together, people to connect, and that innate compassion to extend itself, to increase, really. And so with that, I was also looking at a book called Transforming the Mind by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, teachings on generating compassion. And of course, he has a lot to say and teach us on compassion. And in here, what I was also taken by is that he too talked about the equalizing of self and other. And he talked about the exchanging and equalizing of oneself with others. And again, that equalizing of self and others allows us to do this practice of exchanging oneself with others. We've heard of this as Tong Lin, but let's hear what he has to say. We now turn to a method for transforming the mind, which is exchanging and equalizing oneself with others. Here again, the cultivation of equanimity in this context is understood as the fundamental equality of all beings. So as we cultivate our own personal equanimity, we're also extending that to that equalizing of self and others, remembering that equanimity is that poignant balance of mind that neither needs to go towards nor away from. So then we have a sense that we have the spontaneous wish for happiness, the overcoming of suffering, and that every single person has this. Every single person has the desire for happiness and the wanting to overcome suffering. And so we go deeper into this understanding with this aspiration to be free of suffering. And it says that now we feel that we are equal with others, and so we do a practice which is called the exchange of self and others. And how I was taught was that one breathes in the suffering of others, and one breathes out happiness. And of course, the question becomes, what happens in between? What happens in between that activity? And for a long time, I had that question, how can you really do that? How can you really breathe in somebody's suffering and breathe out happiness? And then finally, I asked that question so many times that the teacher who was teaching it said, it's actually the emptiness that performs the activity. Because I kept thinking, I'm taking in smoke, which is how the books say, I'm taking in people's negativity. But no, it's the wisdom of emptiness that's transforming. So we're recognizing suffering, which we do. Anyone who is sensitive enough is recognizing suffering. We do breathe that in, but it is all transforming in the heart of awareness and emptiness. And that's the secret. So it's really the wisdom factor, and it's also the way where we then can generate our compassion and our personal happiness as well. And this morning we talked about the fact that happiness is truly important for people to experience. And when people are not happy, then they are frustrated, then they are angry, and there's not a way out. So our generating of positive energy is very, very important in our world, and especially today. In the book called The Heart of Unconditional Love by Tulku Thondup, he has a very specific practice, and that practice is quite nice in that it works with the visualization of light. And sometimes we can think, well, when we hear so much suffering and we hear so many problems, do we really want to be visualizing light? And the answer actually is yes, because as we can bring our own minds to that state where we can transform our awareness, then we have that to offer. So that when we breathe in the suffering and breathe out the loving kindness, that it's real and it's impactful. And I know a lot of people who do work where there is working for social change. There are many challenges, and I can remember hearing a talk of Congressman Lewis of Georgia when he was in Portland. And he talked for he talked for well over an hour about the training that he did in the churches, that he took the trainings on how to respond when people became intolerant. And so those who have made an impact have been very, very well trained. And we, as individuals in our lives and communities, this is our training. This is our training. Compassion is our training. Loving kindness is our training. Equalizing self and other is our training. And so when we look at something like a meditation from the Heart of Unconditional Love by Tulku, Thondup, that is also a training. So I'm going to read from him a little bit. And his vision is a vision of a Buddha of light, a Buddha of loving kindness. And once again, within Buddhist tradition, the compassion, the loving kindness is not part of, but it's an aspect of the enlightened mind. And so he says, when you remember the Lord Buddha of loving kindness, your mind instantly becomes the mind of loving kindness. So he sets the stage that what we're reflecting on, we become. And he says that loving kindness is the entryway to the unconditional love that we all long for. And it's always important to remember that our hearts have somewhere in there the wanting to reconnect, the wanting for that unconditional love that just allows. And so he also goes on to say that we use visualization and the reasons for specific visualizations. He said that we can improve the qualities of our mind by changing how we perceive things. And I know sometimes people are very cautious with that. Well, maybe I don't want to change how I see something. Maybe that's distorting. But he says that's the reason we visualize the Buddha of loving kindness in the form of light. The light softens rigidity and harshness of our own minds. So here we are working with our own minds and how to soften rather than react. It makes us soft and gentle. And when we see the Buddha as radiant and captivating, it wakes us up from a dullness, from a sleepiness, and from indifference. So here is the use of light, a Buddha of light, for wakefulness and also for increase. And he goes on to say that we begin by enjoying the loving kindness of the outer Buddha, and we allow that to awaken thoughts and feelings of loving kindness, and then reflecting on our mind as the inner Buddha. So when we have a visualization or a vision, remember this is part of training. There's times when we do not have this. We don't. But there's times where we can make a training for ourselves. And we have the outer Buddha of loving kindness, the inner Buddha of loving kindness. And then we have the mantra, which some of us know, of Om Mani Padme Hung. And we offer this to beings as a radiant blessing of wisdom, love, of the outer and the inner Buddha. And this is the Buddha of loving kindness and of oneself. And when we do this, we see and feel the habitual mental, emotional, and physical ills of beings, such as sickness, sadness, pain, fear, and confusion, take the form of a smoke-like darkness. Here we are with the smoke. And the beams and the rays of light emanating from the outer Buddha and yourself completely fill the bodies and minds with loving kindness. And the light dispels all the darkness in every being's body and mind without leaving a trace. And all are filled with the blessing lights of wisdom, love, and power. And every being fully transforms into a body of radiant blessing light and a mind of all-knowing wisdom, unconditional love, and boundless power, with the sound of Om Mani Padme Hung. And then after a while, we introduce again the Tonglen, the taking and giving, the offering of the radiant blessing lights of loving kindness to others, with again the sound of Om Mani Padme Hung, and then joyfully receive their suffering and confusion in the form of smoke, alternately as taught in most Tonglen practices, offering blessing lights to others with our out-breath to purify them, and lovingly receiving their suffering with your in-breath. What for me was so interesting in learning this is that at first you would think, oh my God, I'm taking in toxins. What am I doing? But after working with the bringing in of people's confusion, allowing that to just dissolve into emptiness, and then breathing out loving kindness, there's strength. And I have no idea if the strength comes from the power of recognizing suffering or the continual wanting to generate loving kindness, but somehow it works. And it probably is why I asked so many questions during this retreat. And I think the teacher didn't really want to tell me the secret that it was all emptiness, because they wanted to get across the technique. But I was persistent. And so there was a question of the name of this particular book, which is The Heart of Unconditional Love, a powerful new approach to loving kindness meditation. And it's by Tulku Thondup, who's just a wonderful teacher. You'll see I have a couple of bookmarks already. And from the Dalai Lama, the book, The Teachings on Generating Compassion, Transforming the Mind. And again, that's by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I think that I really liked the Dalai Lama's title, The Transforming of the Mind. I think sometimes we get very caught in it'll never change, like that, or it's too much. But when we take a step-by-step approach, when we take receiving milk from a humble person, when we receive water, from just a yak tent, and when we have somebody respond to us kindly because they can understand where we are, maybe what we're going through, those are our individual steps, so important. Again, they show feeling, allowing ourselves to relax, to open. Of course, when we relax and open, we do see suffering. And working with the kind of mantra of Thich Nhat Hanh, do not turn our eyes from suffering. And here we have the emphasis on the strength of mind. That's something like Tonglen, or working with light when we think, how can we work with light when we see dark? Um, but we have, I always emphasize the free time to do this practice. We have the means. We are well fed enough. We are healthy enough. And so part of this is actually um, being the light bearers that we can carry on, so that all not is not subsumed in darkness, and that we can generate the inner light of ourselves as the natural Buddha, and also recognizing that we can work with increasing the light within our own minds, and then in meeting others that we can do the exchange of self and other. And I find it a very powerful practice. And also, I'm aware that we're living in a world where there's so many different responses. It's not always, okay, let's be loving, let's generate light. But this is where our own minds have an openness, and so the skillful means needed, which is through perception, calm, equanimity, equalizing self and other, and then we can call upon what's called skillful means. I talked about meeting Congressman Lewis, and I think maybe I've told this story before, but after his lecture of an hour, I was just so completely moved. And those of you who have been in Portland, it was in the room, the lecture room, um, and I was in the front row, and I just I couldn't speak. And so when it was time for his book signing, I just walked up to him with my daughter, and my daughter said to him, "My mother is crying." And so I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." But then somehow, and there was a long line of people, we made an exchange about the town that I was born in, and the town that my parents are buried in the South, and that I was there, for the end of the kind of American apartheid, and then that my grandfather had started a store in a very tiny town that was successful. And when he died, my uncle took over the store. And then when the law was signed that there are now civil rights, my family was the first family in a very tiny town to hire a black person. And so I just told him the name of our town and what my family did, and it's like he just, his mind went back to that time, and he, through his empathy, through his knowing, stopped the book signing and stood up and signed the book to us and handed the book to me standing up, and he said, "Thank your family." And it was another moment, a very unexpected moment of recognition, empathy that one could never imagine. And nor could my grandfather or my uncle, who were both gone. And so it's these small moments, not small, but short moments that for all of us, I'm sure all of us have many stories like that. You know, somebody offered us something. Um, Actually, there was um, a teacher who told told us, my family and I, years later, that a coincidence of running into him in a bookstore in another town was so impactful to him because he was alone. And um, our just walking in the bookstore and, appreciating him meant so much to him at that moment. And we had no idea. We just had no idea. And so we too don't know our own impact. It could be, a basket of cookies, it could be a conversation, it could be a phone call, it could be all of us have this something that was like, oh my goodness, thank you. And so it's important to remember this innate connection and compassion that we really have, and that we really are equal and we all want happiness and we don't want suffering. Even those people who are causing suffering, they want happiness. That's what's so wild about it. Um, and I talked to somebody today, and he had a really, really difficult situation where he was racially profiled, and everyone was so uncomfortable that they kind of shied away, and the person racially profiling him kept wanting to get his attention more, and he stood his ground. And I just said to him, you made this great offering, you know you just made a great offering. So I think it all happens in so many different ways. So yes, we have our techniques. I think they're very powerful to practice because, it's like Congressman Lewis said, that they had to train very um, ardently to know that they would march and that there would be tremendous resistance. And so nonviolent training is a deep training. And so we too are working with, within ourselves, nonviolent training as we increase happiness and decrease suffering. So thank you.